Thank you again, Muge, for that warm introduction, and thank you all for coming out on one of the last nice days of the year to hear about the Arab Spring's aftermath. So I want to talk a little bit about how I perceive what's happened in the roughly 18 months, in some cases it's only a year, since many of the governments of the Middle East were overthrown. And I'll concentrate on Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya. I know Egypt well, having lived almost 4 years of my life there. I don't know Tunisia and Libya nearly as well, but I have been visiting them in the past year, and so I might have some insights from the ground. I've also been to Yemen, and I won't have anything to say about Yemen because it's an extremely complex situation. You should ask our own Professor Alexander Kanish in the Near Eastern Studies Department about it, and it would just take up the whole lecture just to explain the basics of Yemen. So I'm going to concentrate on the three North African countries today. So these dictators were removed by massive demonstrations. Not the first time this sort of thing has happened in the Middle East. 1979 in Iran was a very similar kind of phenomenon. But unlike in Iran, where a figure had emerged, a leader that was widely respected, both, I think, among clerics, but also among lay people across the board, Ayatollah Khomeini, who, when he came back to Iran on February 1st, 1979, the old caretaker government just collapsed on the spot by virtue of his having set foot on the country. And people had someone that they could attach their aspirations to, and so he emerged as the leader, and that was regularized as things went forward in the constitution and so forth. But the North African revolts didn't have an obvious leader. Those governments were overthrown by networks. And it was annoying. I can remember during the time the United States politicians would keep saying, but how do we know who they are? Well, if you have 1 million people in downtown Cairo, they're pretty much everybody. That's who they are. The people of Cairo are really upset. So it's not like there was one group. And what's really remarkable is that these networked revolutions overthrew long-standing presidents for life. And everybody across the board almost thought that the way to go forward from there was to have elections. To have elections for a constituent assembly to write a constitution, to have elections for a parliament, and to have elections for a president, to have the constitution have a democratic element and to be voted upon by referendum. There was very little debate about these issues, and it's not necessarily natural. So the transitions had various characters according to the country. In Egypt, you had a military coup, and so it was very clear that the military was going to be the main social and political force guiding the transitional period towards elections. And of course, it raised a lot of questions in people's minds as to how serious the military was about having elections and whether they might not try to put their finger on the till in various ways. But that was the situation. The military declared itself the ruler of the country. Essentially, you had a collective presidency in the form of 23 officers on the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. And it was the military who appointed the caretaker prime ministers, who then formed civilian governments and appointed cabinet members and so forth, until you got an elected parliament. In Tunisia, the military is small. It's only 30,000 men under arms, and it did not, at least publicly, assert a role. Rather, the transition was overseen initially in accordance with the Tunisian constitution. Ironically, the constitutions of the old regimes were often consequential for these transitions. And so the Speaker of the House was who would take over if the president weren't there anymore. And the old Speaker of the House, Mbazo, who wasn't very well liked and had cooperated with the dictator Ben Ali, nevertheless formed the first transitional government. There were demonstrations and he had to be ultimately switched out. One of the problems with the civilian transitional governments is that they were more or less self-appointed and didn't have very much legitimacy, and they were aware of this. So on the one hand, you had a country that just had a revolution. The president is gone. The state, which had been in everybody's business, has collapsed. And so you need somebody to take charge. But at the same time, the people who have taken charge are non-entities, maybe not very well known, weren't high up where they wouldn't be acceptable, and timid about doing anything because they have no legitimacy. Nobody elected them to be there. The Egyptian military didn't feel that way about it, but the other transitions were more of that sort. So in Libya, likewise, there's some old cabinet members from Gaddafi's time, or bureaucrats or technocrats who defected early on to Benghazi, who emerged to lead the transition. In Yemen, again, Yemen is an outlier, and I won't say that much about it, but Yemen was unlike any of the other three cases in the sense that first of all, the dictator, Saleh, agreed to put the opposition in his government. And so half of the cabinet posts went to the opposition parties, the ones who were trying to overthrow the government. It would be like the Tsar, offering Lenin the Ministry of Interior. It was bizarre. And then when they finally did get Saleh to step down, they had a referendum last January in which Saleh's vice president, who was from the same party as Saleh, was the only candidate. And he did very well. The only thing you can say about those elections that's positive is that 80% of people came out to vote, even though they knew they only had one choice, which seems to suggest that this way of doing things was relatively popular. So the transitions in Yemen have been a lot kind of more consensual and joint and messy and without such clear outcomes. But in Libya, of course, the Gaddafi government was altogether overthrown, and the people who didn't defect, I'd say by late March, were up the creek. If they were captured, they would be tried, and so forth. But all of them were transitional towards what? Towards elections. And this is not something that I would have taken for granted, because I started going to the Middle East, well, the first time I was ever there was a teenager in 1968 in Beirut, and then I went back to live in the 70s, but people weren't so enthusiastic about Western forms of government at that time, except maybe in Lebanon. They had some purchase, but the Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in his book about the Gulag, one of the characters at one point says, as he's suffering in Stalin's prison camp in the late 40s, he's represented as saying, it's something that's kind of surprising to myself, but I'm getting interested in bourgeois democracy. And that's what happened after the upheavals. The Arabs are getting interested in bourgeois democracy. They say they want free, fair, transparent parliamentary elections. Formation of parties at will. Formation of labor unions at will. Contestation in the political arena. Horse trading. And that's not like it was in the 70s still, people wanted the man on horseback. And if they were dissatisfied with the government, they wanted a different man on horseback, but not necessarily popular sovereignty. And when I first went to Egypt in '74, there was no parliament. Sadat just started having parliamentary elections in the late 70s. But, those dictators sometimes did have something called a parliament, but they were like the old Russian Duma. They had no power. They were just debating societies. And the elections that were held for them were phony. They were like the old-style Chicago elections, where the dead vote. It's very democratic. Everybody gets to vote. There's a party machine that ensures that it wins. So, but they kept having those phony elections. And it turns out that, you know, there were people who canvassed and who participated in them and got some experience with them, especially in Egypt. And it turns out that the only difference between the phony elections and the real elections comes at the end when they can't count the ballots. So the phony elections turned out to be fair practice, I think, as I said, especially in Egypt, for what came after. And then the secularists wanted a kind of colonel or a man on horseback who would uplift the nation by the force of his personality. The fundamentalists, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Nahda party in Tunisia, and so forth, well, you know, back in the 30s and 40s when a lot of these movements began, Nahda is more recent, they talked about having a supreme guide. People argue about how open to democratic elections Hassan al-Banna was, because he did allow his people to run in the 1941 elections in Egypt. But that's supreme guide business. That doesn't sound very democratic to me. And I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood was about having democratic elections in the 50s and 60s. So something changed. Both the Arab left, the Nasserists and the communists and the socialists, and they had a lot of little parties and so forth, were generally left, and the fundamentalists, both in the past 2 decades have switched over and have begun thinking that the Western European style of governance is what they want, that Britain, France, Spain, Germany, that's what's normal, that's normal political life. And they're willing to play that game. And this, I really think that the Western press has missed the boat on this. If what I'm saying is true, this is the most important political development in the Middle East in 100 years. This is incredible. The people all across all of the political spectrums now want parliamentary democracy as their form of government. So in Tunisia, there is one exception, which is the Salafis, but I'll get to that. Not all of the Salafis either are exceptions. But in Tunisia, they had their transition and their transitional government. It was led by, ultimately by a man named Qaed Sebsi, who was, you know, an old-style Tunisian nationalist, thought well of Habib Bourguiba and that post-colonial generation of relatively liberal-minded, but nevertheless very authoritarian people. I heard a reggae band in Tunis who had made a satirical song about Qaed Sebsi when he was the transitional prime minister. I can't do reggae, but it went Qaed Sebsi biddu demokratiya aindu hukuma la shar'iyya. Qaed Sebsi wants democracy, but he has an illegitimate government, because I told you those transitional governments really weren't very legitimate. So in the parliamentary elections that were held on October 23rd, 2011, the outcome was not a big surprise for those who had been watching Tunisia carefully, but I have an interpretation of it. None of the parties, the small, mainly leftist parties, that had been allowed to operate in Tunisia by Ben Ali, under, you know, the main party, the one-party state, was the Rally for Constitutional Democracy. These Arab dictators, you know, they'd never read Orwell, and they had not the slightest sense of irony. So all of the censorship bureaus were called the Ministry of Information, and they had these parties like the National Democratic Party in in Egypt, which I called Three Lies. And then they had the Rally for Constitutional Democracy in Tunisia. And it was this seedy police state, which took cues from the Stasi in East Germany. But anyway, that party was the main party, and almost everybody had to belong to it. They did allow, a few of these small leftist parties to operate. So those parties were hoping to do well, and they didn't. Nobody, and they sequestered about 14,000 officials of the old regime who were not allowed to be in these elections. So the elections in Tunisia really elected people who had been on the outs with Ben Ali. The Nahda party, the Muslim fundamentalist one, had been severely persecuted by Ben Ali. People were jailed all the time for thought crimes, were tortured. That party was almost wiped out. And it's quite amazing. It was able to come back from being wiped out. And it played almost no role in the revolution itself in December and January of 2010, 2011. But it came back to get 37% of the seats and was very popular in the countryside and so forth. But its main claim to fame was that it had been persecuted by Ben Ali. And people didn't want Ben Ali back. I interviewed people at the Nahda party headquarters in Tunis, and I said, how did you keep yourself going during those years when you were deeply persecuted? I mean, where were you? How did you organize? And they looked at me, they said, where were we? We were in jail. And Hamadi Jabali, who became the prime minister, was himself, he was a journalist. He was editor of the Fajr newspaper, which is the Nahda fundamentalist newspaper. And so he emerges as the prime minister. The president, a secularist who was willing to go into coalition with the Nahda, is Munsaf Marzouki, an old-time secular human rights activist, also had been in jail. So that's what I'm trying to tell you, is that you can't think about these elections as ideological, that, oh, the Tunisians, they put on a secular front, but actually they put the Nahda in power, the fundamentalists. You scratch a Tunisian, you find a fundamentalist. That's not the dynamic that was going on in Tunisia. They just didn't want Ben Ali back, and they didn't want Ben Ali's cousins back, or his in-laws back, or anybody from that social class back. And so they were making sure to put in the people that had been in jail because they thought they would make a stand and really change the country. They did get a little bit of a shock with the Nahda because Jabali, soon after he was made prime minister, gave a talk out in a rural town where it's really strong Nahda fundamentalist atmosphere. And he said, now we have a chance of, I think he said for the sixth caliph, but it came out in the press that he said the sixth caliphate. And a lot of secular Tunisians had voted for a Nahda for the reasons I suggested. So they were suffering some buyer's remorse because they said, we didn't, when we went to the ballot box, we didn't have in mind any caliphates. So Jabali scared the horses a little bit. And I was kind of confused as to what did he mean by the sixth caliphate, because who would be the five caliphates? I mean, that's not how Islamic history was. So I looked into it, and I asked Tunisians, and it turns out that he was actually making a reference to Umayyad. The first big Arab empire was the Umayyad Empire. And the first few caliphs of it were considered impious in one way or another. But the sixth of them was pious. So what he was saying was the first five Umayyad caliphs were like Bourguiba and Ben Ali and so forth, and now we have a chance for the pious caliph, which is the Nahda party. So it would still be disturbing to a Tunisian who mainly has Voltaire as her reference, but it wasn't as sinister as some people made it out to be. And so that's, if you looked at the top five vote-earning parties, and it goes way down from there, in these elections, the Nahda is got 80-some seats and is the biggest single party, but all those other little ones are center, left, center. The Progressive Democratic Party, in American politics, they'd all be considered what you might call socialist. So and if you add them all up, there are as many as there are more than the Nahda. So the Nahda only got a plurality of the seats, and there were some defectors to the Nahda afterwards. I think their final total was 42%. But they didn't get a majority, and therefore they couldn't pass fundamentalist laws, as many Tunisians had been afraid they would, because they couldn't win any vote unless the secularists joined in with them. And ultimately the Nahda said, well, we won't even try to put a principle in the new constitution that says that Sharia or Islamic law would be the basis for Tunisian law. So, well, if you're a fundamentalist party and you give up on that, you're not doing your job. So, this thing about Tunisia going Islamist, in my view, it's way, way over exaggerated. And the Nahda emerged as an important party, but we knew that they were an important party. And the only way they got the prime ministership was that if the two big secularist parties had made an alliance, they could have had a majority, and they could have marginalized the Nahda. And Marzouki didn't do that deliberately because he thought it would send a bad signal to the country about national reconciliation after the fall of Ben Ali for the first election just to take the largest single party, which was the Muslim Fundamentalist Party, and marginalize it. So he wanted them in government. And he was viciously attacked by the secularists in Tunisia for being willing to do this. But Tunisia hasn't been taken over by Muslim fundamentalists. And I was in Tunisia, I've been in Tunisia several times by now. I was there under Ben Ali, and I went back in summer of 2011, and then I went back in May. And I can't tell any difference about the aftermath of the Nahda takeover in Tunisia. Didn't seem to me to be so far very consequential for people's lives. I mean, fundamentalist Muslim parties often want to ban alcohol and drive people to smoke pot instead. To my knowledge, there hasn't been any of that sort of thing, and the Tunisians drinking beer in public all the time. So you don't feel it if you're on the streets or you're talking to people and so forth that you now have a Nahda government. And of course the Nahda is a minority, it's a minority government in a way. There have been a number of high-powered, high visibility conflicts which have helped to create this image of Tunisia as moving to the religious right. And I don't deny that there is some of that. I got to Tunisia in summer of 2011 soon after Salafis had gathered and thrown stones outside a theater where a movie was being shown by a Tunisian secularist about Tunisian secularism. And these young men came and tried to disrupt it. The Salafis are the wannabe Saudis of the Sunni world. They dress like Saudis. They insist on having beards. The women wear the full Gulf-style niqab veil, the black complete covering. You can see them down there. And I can't tell you how tiny they are in Tunisia. Tunisia is about French education and white sand beaches, and maybe out in the small towns on the edge of the desert, this kind of thinking might have some purchase. But it's not what Tunis or for that matter, Sfax or Sousse is about. So personally, I think there are a couple of city quarters where some of the working class guys have Salafi tendencies, but there are a couple thousand Salafis in Tunis who have a meeting on a weekend and think, well, how could we get a headline? Well, we could throw stones outside a theater. And so then it creates this image. But then the other 364 days of the year, nothing going on. So every once in a while, the Salafis will come out and do something in public that's relatively violent. And they burned the car park in the US Embassy on Saturday. But they're just a tiny, tiny group, and they're not that, and they didn't get any seats in parliament. They're just now forming a party. So if you go to Tunisia and you talk to secular Tunisians, they only want to talk about how the threat of the Salafis taking over. And I asked myself, well, how would they do that? But they have made trouble. So there was a private TV station that showed this film Persepolis, which is by an Iranian expatriate about the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution and what it did to the Iranian middle class who had to go into exile. And it has a scene, as is common in Western cartooning, of God. And the Salafis are iconoclasts, and they objected to God being shown on this television station. So they can, and I think the government doesn't want trouble with the Salafis. If you have people who, have C4 explosives or gasoline cans and are willing to deploy them when they're upset, one of the things you would do is try to calm them down and not make them upset. So the government did prosecute Nabil Karoui, the director of the Nesma TV that showed this film, and ultimately I think he was given a small fine. That was how they tried to make the Salafis happy, I think. And then there have been anti-Salafi demonstrations. 8,000 secularists marched against the Salafis in January. And there have been attacks by Salafis on unveiled women, especially out in the boondocks and provincial towns, they might do this. Tunisia, although I said that its urban centers are very secular, very Frenchified, not what you would call Salafi territory, the country does have a strong divide. So the rural towns and cities are much more pious, much more religious, and there was one of the ways that they protested against Ben Ali was to double down on religion. And so this is from a rooftop in the southern desert city of Kairouan, which is a big city, and it's known as Nahda territory, and I think also has Salafis, and so it's very unlike Tunis. In opinion polling, even from the 70s, 20% of Tunisians were saying they had no religion. In the United States at the same time, it was 8%. So Tunisians were much more secular in the United States. And our non-religious people have doubled now to 16%, but they're still less than the Tunisians. It's just something to think about. So that's the mosque attached to the shrine of the hair of the Prophet. There was a companion of the Prophet who came allegedly to Tunisia in the early Islamic period, and so there's a relic there. He was the Prophet's barber, and he brought a lock of hair with him. So that's the kind of piety you have in southern Tunisia. Rashid Ghannouchi is the ideological leader of the Nahda party. He hasn't taken a political position, but he founded it and guides it and has written a lot over the years. He's one of those people where I don't think back in the 70s he was very interested in democracy. But I interviewed him in May when I was in Tunisia, and I asked him right out. I said, have you accepted popular sovereignty? I keep asking the fundamentalists this. And he said yes. Wasn't any hesitation about it. Sometimes Ghannouchi beats around the bush a little bit when he's not comfortable with a question. But in this case, he was very forthright, very forceful. He said, yes, we have accepted popular sovereignty. What it means is, if you're playing politics and you accept popular sovereignty, it means you would accept being defeated. So if the hardline secularists win the election, you go home. You accept that that's who won. You accept the verdict of the people. And that's something that the fundamentalists had trouble with. And they say that at the time of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, young people came to Ayatollah Khomeini and said, let's call it the Democratic Islamic Republic of Iran. And Khomeini didn't like that idea at all. And he said, if 37 million Iranians said X and God said Y, who would be right? So that kind of thinking is anti-popular sovereignty that, of course, it assumes that you know what God's will is. And a lot of these parties now a lot of these groups, like the Muslim Brotherhood and the Nahda, are actually not running themselves so much as they're forming auxiliary civil parties. And the people in those parties say that we don't have a line to God. We're just human beings, and we have a vision for society, but we could be wrong. So if we get defeated in the polls, we get defeated in the polls. So they're not going for a theocracy, according to what they say. And Ghannouchi kind of smiled mischievously. He said, well, why should we be afraid of the will of the people? More especially here in Tunisia, where most of the people are Muslim. Again, I think if Ghannouchi is sincere, and the Muslim Brotherhood is sincere, and this political process goes forward on this basis, this is the most important thing to happen to Islam since the reform movements of the late 19th century and the rise of the original Salafis with Jamal ad-Din Afghani and Muhammad Abdu. I mean, this is a big moment in Islamic political thinking, that if they accommodate themselves to popular sovereignty. So this is La Marsa. It's a neighborhood in La Marsa, and it's celebrating the 100th anniversary of the founding of La Marsa, which it was founded under French colonial rule and is kind of a very shishi place. And the young people came out, and they're playing rock music in the background, and they're chalking up the sidewalk. And this is why I say that, can you see any Salafis in that picture? That's Tunisia. And I thought, this is great. They're selling their sidewalk art. So it's a triptych that I caught on my camera there hanging on the wall, and these were for sale. The first one says Gay Pride. The second one is a mosque. And the third one says in French, Tunisie libre, free Tunisia. There's a democratic Tunisia. So that's pretty much, you know, I can leave the Tunisia part of my lecture now. That's Tunisia. Now in Egypt, where the military made a coup, the Muslim Brotherhood had established this Freedom and Justice Party. One of the reasons it had to found a separate civil party is that the Muslim Brotherhood is a little bit cult-like in the sense that to be a member you have to swear fealty to the supreme guide. And so it would raise issues if the president owed obedience to the supreme guide of the Muslim Brotherhood. They actually, the people in that party, if they get elected to office, they resign from the Brotherhood so as not to have to owe fealty to the supreme guide. The Salafis in Egypt are a significant group. They're still small in my view, but they're much more influential and important in Egypt than they are in Tunisia. And in Egypt, I asked my former professor, Saadetdin Ibrahim, who's a major human rights activist in Egypt and also a sociologist of modern Islam in Egypt, and I asked him, you know, Saad, we never heard anything about Salafis of this sort in Egypt. I mean, Salafi was, in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was a movement called the Salafis, which was about forming a liberal Islam. You know, Muhammad Abdu corresponded with Leo Tolstoy and theorized that maybe those invisible jinn mentioned in the Quran were actually Louis Pasteur's bacteria. So that kind of liberal, scientific, forward-looking reaction to European advances is not what we think of when we nowadays think of Salafis. I said, and then we knew there were some people called Salafis in the 90s, but they never came out. They were quietists. So I said, where does this come from? And he said, well, think about it. Since the oil boom of the 1970s, he estimates that 25 million Egyptians have spent at least some time as guest workers in Saudi Arabia or other conservative Gulf countries. So while they were there, they more or less converted to the Wahhabi form of Islam that's typical in Saudi Arabia, which, you know, has morals police and insists that men wear beards and women all cover up, and is a much more kind of rigid Gulf tradition of Islam, which is a minority thing in the vast Muslim world. There are 22 million Saudi Wahhabis and 1.5 billion Muslims. And the Sunni Muslims in Egypt and Jordan and elsewhere often consider Wahhabism to be a heresy still. It has several tenets that the Sunnis don't accept. So in the West, we tend to talk about Saudi Arabia as a Sunni country. But if you're in the Middle East, not so much. They're Wahhabis. And so when these guys came back and they had converted to Wahhabism, they couldn't declare it because the rest of the villagers would beat them up. So they said they were Salafis. So Salafism was a reform movement within Sunni Islam. So they're just a kind of Salafi. Instead of being the Leo Tolstoy reading Salafis, they were the Wahhabi Salafis. So that's where they seem to have come from. And they're scattered throughout a lot of villages and towns in Egypt. They're not concentrated in one place. And you don't see them that much because they dress distinctively, and the women dress distinctively. And in Cairo, I mean, I almost never saw Salafis. So it came as a big surprise that they did really well. They formed this Noor party, and they did really well in the first round of the parliamentary elections, part of the Egyptian transition over which the military and its civilian appointees presided. But you can see the light green is the Freedom and Justice Party, the civil branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then the dark green, I guess on this, it's coming up on the screen is, what is that? Brown, I guess. Yeah, olive. The dark olive is the Noor or Salafi party. So between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Noor, they had parliament. They could pass laws, and they were starting to demand that they be allowed to write the new constitution. And you know, most Egyptians, even if they're not purely secular, they're go along to get along kind of people. They're moderate. They like their beer. And the idea of Salafis writing the Egyptian constitution was very alarming to them. And how the Salafis pulled off this 23%, I still couldn't tell you. It's a big surprise. Some people say they have televangelists. They have people who come on television and preach who are very, very popular who are Salafis. Other people theorize that Salafis, you know, you figure they wouldn't steal from you. And what government in Egypt has been about for decades has been all the bureaucrats and the government stealing from you. And so they're the anti-Mubaraks. Instead of sending the money to the Swiss banks, they might actually spend it on you and so forth. So they might just have a reputation of being very upright, and you would like that in government. I guarantee you, whatever's going on here, it's not a vote against beer and bikinis, which is how it was interpreted in the outside world. But then they moved in May and June to the first round of presidential elections. And the first round of the presidential elections, in my view, was the first time that we got a contemporary sense of the political geography of Egypt. It was the French in the 19th century invented this science of political geography. And we use it in American politics, like when we say that, you know, Romney can count on the red states. We can count up all the counties in certain parts of the country that vote Republican. Well, that's political geography. Well, we had no idea what the political geography of Egypt was, and even the parliamentary elections were not very good at revealing it to us. But these presidential elections did. There were 14 candidates, but there really were 5 major ones. And they were Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamdin Sabahi, who was an old-style Nasserist leftist, labor left. And then there was Amr Musa, who had been foreign minister under Mubarak in the 90s, but broke with him and became Secretary General of the Arab League, who was, you know, kind of a mainstream secular Egyptian, kind of slightly of the old regime, but maybe a little bit rehabilitated. Then there was Ahmed Shafiq, who was straight old regime. He had been Mubarak's last prime minister. He had been an Air Force general. Mubarak was an Air Force general. And he had been Minister of Aviation. His claim to fame was that they say he had done a good job with refurbishing Cairo's international airport. And he ran for president. And he represented the regime that was overthrown. I mean, this is quite remarkable. It would be kind of a little bit like Cheney running for office now. I mean, it would be odd that such a, let's face it, despised former regime should put forward one of its central characters as the candidate. And then there was Abdul Mun'im Abul Futuh, who had been Muslim Brotherhood, and then in the late 90s broke with the Muslim Brotherhood because he considered it too fundamentalist. And so he's a Muslim, he's committed to Muslim values in in politics, but he likes the Sufi mystics and he likes the liberals, and he turned to belief in parliamentary democracy before they did, so he's kind of the liberal Muslim candidate. And I was in Egypt for this first round of presidential elections, and the Egyptians, I can't tell you how excited they were. I talked to a lot of different kinds of people. I went everywhere in Egypt, in Cairo at that time, and since there were 14 candidates, you had a wide choice, and everyone you talked to was supporting a different one. The political pluralism was very striking to me because I'd been going to Egypt since '74, and there was just one guy, right, all that time, serially, and to have people say, no, it should be Morsi, no, it should be Hamdin Sabahi, was really quite remarkable. So people were enthusiastic, and they came out to vote in fairly large numbers. They segregated the polling by gender, so this is the women's polling. And you see that's the kind of common dress of Egyptian Muslim women nowadays. They tend to wear something over their heads, and then they dress modestly for the rest, maybe jeans with a skirt over it. And you can see this girl is bareheaded, but that's a little unusual. She might be a Copt or she might be a secularist, but I would say 95% of women wear some kind of veil now or headscarf. But it doesn't tell you anything about their politics. You can't read off anything about them. It's mainly, as far as I can tell, it's so that the boys won't pinch them and harass them. And it doesn't work. One reporter kind of got in a little trouble because she was talking to one of these women at a polling station and discovered she was voting for Hamdin Sabahi, who's the far left candidate. And she's saying, well, what's a Mohagaba doing voting for the left? But people upbraided her for reading people's values off of the way they dress. So in this first round of the presidential election, actually the fundamentalists lost. It was the opposite of the parliamentary elections. So Morsi and Shafiq got the biggest number of votes there on that side. But Sabahi did very well and almost did well enough to be in the runoffs. And he took Alexandria. The labor unions came out for him. This left labor stuff going on. I was very excited about it. And you could see its geography as well. Morsi did very well in Upper Egypt, in the rural areas. Abul Futuh and Amr Musa did less well. But if you count up all of the seculars, as Amr Musa, Sabahi, and Shafiq, they got 60% of the vote amongst them. And then even Abul Futuh, you have to wonder whether you want to consider him a Muslim fundamentalist candidate because he was campaigning on liberalism. So the Muslim Brotherhood candidate didn't do that well in the first round. He did well enough to get into the second round, but he didn't do that well. It was the opposite of what had happened with the parliamentary elections. So then it went to runoff between Morsi, the guy with the beard at the top, who's trained as an engineer at the University of Southern California. His children are American citizens, and he worked for a while at the California State University Northridge, and apparently worked on a project for the National Aerospace Administration, NASA. So one old Egyptian who was very gung-ho about Morsi said, even NASA needed Dr. Morsi. Why wouldn't Egypt need Dr. Morsi? So then he ran against this former Air Force general and Mubarak crony, Ahmed Shafiq. And I have to say, the poor Egyptians were given a Hobson's choice here. This is the worst possible configuration you could have had. And these were not the most popular politicians, but they just happened to get into the runoffs. So they had a choice between somebody who said Mubarak was like a father to him. I mean, even if you felt that way, and you were running for president of Egypt after the revolution, do you really need to say it? And then the Muslim Brotherhood guy. So they weren't very happy about that. In the midst of all this, the old parliament, which had this Muslim fundamentalist dominance, was dissolved by the Supreme Court. And it's disturbing in some ways, but actually in my view, there's a legal basis for it. In the elections for parliament, they had set aside 1/3 of seats for independents. And the old socialist constitution had set aside a half of the seats for workers and peasants, right? It was a socialist deal. So they weren't set aside for workers and peasants anymore, but they did keep 1/3, and they felt like maybe that would keep the old regime people from coming back. They had name recognition, so the independents who ran would be less likely to be old party hacks and so forth. But the Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood didn't honor that agreement that 1/3 of the seats would be run by independents, and they ran their party members, known Muslim Brotherhood members and so forth, in the independent constituencies. And it's one of the reasons that they won so big. So the Supreme Court said you broke the rules, and the resulting parliament is illegitimate, so they dissolved it. And so then you went to the presidential elections. This is a real roller coaster ride. You had a parliament, then you didn't have a parliament, and then you didn't know the Muslim Brotherhood or the old regime is going to get in, and then the military is lurking in the background and so forth. But you can see Morsi is the blue, is the Muslim fundamentalist candidate. Does that look like a fundamentalist wave to you? Nearly half the country voted for the Mubarak clone. I mean, I'm sure they held their nose and voted for it, but this is not a sign that the Brotherhood is necessarily taking over Egypt. Then finally, let me just say a couple words about Libya. Again, you had a transitional national council. A lot of the cities in Libya felt like it was awfully a do-nothing council, and they started having municipal elections. They would just announce, it had been a revolution, there was no government, so if they wanted to have election, they would. So Zintan, Misrata, Benghazi, they just announced they're going to have municipal elections. They're going to run their own affairs since the central government was no good. And then they did schedule parliamentary elections for summer of 2012. I'm showing you some pictures of Libya just because this is what used to be called Green Square under Gaddafi. This is where he would give his 9-hour-long speeches. And it's now called Martyr Square. And it's kind of a park kind of atmosphere. People come out and you see there's they had set up this little children's carnival, and you can hear the children squealing until 8 o'clock at night. And I'm showing you these because there's a black legend around Libya that it's a complete mess and it's a militia-ridden society. And it's not that that's not true, but it's giving the wrong impression of the place. I've lived in militia-ridden societies, and one of the things that's typical of them is that you see militiamen and they stop you and ask you for your papers and so forth. I went all over Libya, I never saw any militiamen. They're just not visible. And the shops are open, nobody seems to be afraid. The militias come out and they make demands, and there's some neighborhoods maybe where they're strong. But it's not like Beirut was in the old days, which is the kind of impression I got from the press. I was surprised at how normal life was. And this is a hard argument to make this week, because in Benghazi, about 40 of these guys, the Salafis, attacked the US consulate and killed the ambassador. And I have friends, the realist political scientists, who make fun of me for saying, well, it's, in the larger scheme of things, it's not representative of the real Libya. But I maintain that that's true. 40 guys with guns can make trouble in any country. And the government is still weak. Here, when I was there in May, in June, there was already campaigning. That's the Party of Libyan Unity. All those campaign posters were everywhere. That's in Benghazi. This guy, I think, was running for the city council. A woman got the most votes in Benghazi, and she was a very respected professor of finance at the university. That is a woman her name is Nawara, and she ran for parliament, and she's the headmistress of a school. She's a very substantial person in Benghazi, and she won't bail. 20% of the people elected in the parliamentary elections were women, and they had no quota. This was volunteer. The Libyans are more progressive about this than we are, because 20% of Congress people are not women. When you think about this Islamic wave that supposedly overtook the Middle East, think about that. And then in the parliamentary elections, there were 200 seats. 80 were set aside for parties. The other rest were independents. The Muslim Brotherhood did very poorly. It only got 10% of seats. So I conclude the Libyans not particularly fundamentalist people. Certainly they don't want the fundamentalists running their government. Nationalists dominated. It's not that they don't pray and so forth, but they're not political Islam. And a centrist, Mustafa Abu Shughur, was elected prime minister on September 12th, the day after the Benghazi attacks. And that kind of got drowned out. For the first time in history, Libya has a freely, democratically elected prime minister. And by the way, he's a colleague. He taught electrical engineering for many years at the University of Alabama, Huntsville. So just to conclude, I'm arguing that in electoral politics, the dominance of the fundamentalist parties in the post-revolutionary period has been exaggerated, and I understand why that is, because the first round of parliamentary elections in Egypt kind of set a tone, and then Morsi won the presidency. But in Tunisia, they only got 37% of the seats. It was kind of a fluke that Marzouki was willing to let them have the prime ministership, and then they had to give up an Islamic agenda and the constitution writing to survive. The Muslim Brotherhood barely won the presidency against Shafiq, and I think that's a huge embarrassment for the Brotherhood that they are only that popular. And then the violence that we've seen with the Salafis attacking things, especially in the last week, I'm arguing that that's not representative of where mainstream politics is. I'm not saying it's not important, it's not consequential, but it's not what's going on in these countries. I mean, you can always get 500 people together for a demonstration, and some of them can throw Molotov cocktails and so forth. But if we look at the big political and social processes, Salafis are important, and probably the Muslim fundamentalists are playing we know they're playing a much bigger role than they had under the secular dictatorships. But this is a very complex political terrain in which leftists and workers and women and all kinds of political forces are running for office, are expressing themselves, are writing op-eds, and often are winning in parliamentary politics. And even where the Muslim fundamentalists are winning, they are now saying they will respect the rules of the parliamentary game, and if they lose the next election, they'll go home and let the secularists rule. So I think that there's a kind of a trope about, well, yes, they had these wonderful revolutions, but then they turned out to all be seedy fundamentalists, and you Americans shouldn't identify with them or think well of them. I mean, that's what the neoconservative line was. That's why they say Islamic winter followed the Arab Spring. A lot of people in the United States on the right were very unhappy that young Americans identified with the revolutionaries and thought well of Arabs for the first time in a long time. And I'm saying that analysis of the Islamic winter is not in accordance with the complexity of the political situation on the ground and largely incorrect. Thank you very much. And I'll be very glad to take questions. Yeah?
Could you comment on the situation in Syria?
Could I comment on the situation in Syria? Well, I carefully crafted this whole thing to avoid that. Syria is very much like Libya in the sense that there's a small professional military. In Syria, it's a much bigger one than in Libya had, but which is very tied to the regime, and which is perfectly willing to roll tanks, fly planes, and use military equipment to attack its own people. And it started doing this even when the people were mainly having peaceful protests and before they were driven into taking up arms. So where you have a military willing to do that, as you did in Libya and Syria, these popular revolts and demonstrations can easily turn into civil war, and that's what's happened. And once they turn to civil war, and once some significant proportion of the population just is very irritated and raw by the regime, which has now killed their relatives and their friends, it can just grind on and on and on, and there are reprisals on both sides, and both sides are driven to be more brutal and more radical. And we saw this all through the 1990s in Algeria. And there, in the end, the state won. It's a very fragile victory and sullen and not a very good atmosphere, but the generals, the secular generals, are still there. Syria looks different from Algeria to me in the sense that the Free Syrian Army now does seem to have territory. There seems to be a lot of the country that the Syrian government no longer really controls. And I see a movement against the government. So I'll give the government, I'll give the revolutionaries about a 70 to 30 chance of succeeding at this point, even without any further outside intervention than they're having. Because that implies that the Qataris and the Saudis will keep sending them arms, which is what they're doing. Iran is sending arms to the government. But I don't give them a 100% chance of succeeding. And I think that it's many months. If they do succeed, it's many months before they do. My guess is that if they do succeed, the final scenario is a little bit similar to Libya in the sense that Gaddafi fell in Libya when Tripoli, the capital, rose up against him. And capitals are very important in history. We historians have noticed that the rulers tend to try to make the people in the capital happy. And it's when the rulers fail to do that, as in France in 1789, that the regime falls. You get big crowds in the capital, they can move on the presidential palace. I mean, they're an immediate threat to the personnel of the state. So the Syrian economy is paralyzed, people have less and less money, there's increasingly hunger, so at some point, the people in the capital may decide they just can't take this regime anymore. Now, the regime did things for people. It gave them business licenses, it gave them work. In a socialist economy, as Syria more or less had, 50% of the people probably were working for the state. So, and especially in the capital, it's very government-oriented. So people had a lot of reason not to want to rock that boat because their livelihoods are in question. But at some point, if their livelihood is anyway being destroyed, they may decide to come out. And so if Damascus rises, I think it's all over for al-Assad. But it hasn't happened yet, and I don't know if it will happen. Yeah.
I guess left out of this discussion is the discussion of Iraq. Iraq has a political culture, it has a popular sovereignty of some sort. So I'm wondering if you can compare the Iraq experience to what you saw in Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt.
Yeah, well, the question is about Iraq and its place in all this. Iraq had the misfortune of having its post-Saddam political system set up by the Americans and the UN to some extent, and they did it wrong. And so Iraq has a unicameral legislature, at least so far, and it's an ethnically highly divided society politically. So political scientists who have studied these matters find that one-chamber legislatures and large numbers of political minorities cause trouble because it's majority rule, right? So the Sunnis in Iraq are going to lose every vote in parliament from now to eternity. There's no way for them to outvote the Shiites. Now, maybe if they made a coalition with the Kurds and a few Shiites, they could put together some kind of ramshackle thing and maybe win a vote sometimes. So far, that hasn't happened. And they've tried. I mean, Ayad Alawi, who leads the party for which most Sunnis voted in the past election in 2010, the Iraqiyya party, attempted to basically force a vote of no confidence on the Shiite Prime Minister al-Maliki, who isn't very popular at the moment. And he completely failed. So, and that's just the shape of Iraqi politics. And the other thing is that there are, because of the ethnic component of the way politics is conducted, all parliaments are hung parliaments. When you have an election and there's not only no majority party, but there's no party that can be sure of having a majority, put together a coalition of smaller partners and could win subsequent votes of no confidence. That's called a hung parliament. And in Britain, when you have a hung parliament, if you can't make a deal in the end, you just have to have new elections. So actually, Britain came very close to having to do that in the past election. If the Lib Dems hadn't joined with the Conservatives, there would have been a hung parliament. They'd have had to have another election. Well, elections in Iraq are hard to hold because the guerrillas blow them up. So you have to like close down the country for 3 days and stop people from driving so they can't pre-position car bombs at the polling stations. And so you don't want to have elections very often because they're just endless trouble. But in the last election you had the Muqtada Sadr group, the Dawa party of Nouri al-Maliki, both of them fundamentalist Shiites, but one more fundamentalist, the other, and hating each other. That was two groups, and then you had the Kurds and the Sunnis, the Iraqiyya and the Kurdistan Patriotic Alliance. Well, all of them kept trying after the elections were held in March of 2010 to form a government, and that would require at least two of them getting together. And they kept negotiating with each other, and they kept negotiating with each other, and all four of them all hated the other three. So it was impossible to form a government. And finally, Iran came in and instructed Muqtada Sadr that he would too make up with al-Maliki and form a big Shiite coalition which would have a majority. And then once al-Maliki looked like he would be the Shiite candidate, he made promises to the Kurds and they came around, and so they finally formed a government. But it's a very ramshackle government, and since then Muqtada Sadr has more or less withdrawn from that coalition that he was forced into by Iran. It's never a good sign when politics is being dictated from the outside. And I think the Americans had been instigating Alawi to try to get a vote of no confidence and pull al-Maliki down. Now al-Maliki has sided with Bashar al-Assad in Syria and with Tehran, but he's supposedly an American ally. So I think Iraqi politics needs to be reformulated. They need a new constitution. If I were in charge of it, and we don't want any more Americans in charge of it, that's quite enough now. But if I were in charge of it, I'd do what the old Egyptian regime did and forbid parties that had a religious base. And I'd try to set it up so that you could only win elections if you could appeal to Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds across that there would be national parties. And address this problem, and I'd have a bicameral legislature. I'd have an upper house which maybe overrepresented the minorities. But as the system now exists, with the present constitution, the present way of doing things, I think you essentially have a hung parliament forever. And so it's a very, very unpromising situation. And we see that the guerrilla movement, which doesn't hold territory, unlike in Syria, and doesn't seem to be able actually to produce political change, nevertheless regularly blows the country up. And in this last round you had 100 people killed with bombs going off, and I counted 26 separate municipalities all over the country, north and south and so forth. So, and this happens every 4 months. So there's still this very lively guerrilla group that's trying to destabilize the country and having some success. So between the deadlock in parliamentary politics and the guerrilla movements, I think Iraq is stuck, and I don't know how it will get itself unstuck.
A question, you said you would give a different structure to it, but what structure would be suitable to achieve what you want?
Well, Karina Pirelli, who's an old-time UN official and had been in Peru and so forth, was asked to set up the Iraqi system. And she went for a list system, which is used in Spain and some other countries. And it's wrong. It causes trouble, and it often causes minority governments and so forth. So just as a basic step, I'd get rid of the list system. For a while there, the list system was national, so you might have no representative from Basra because the parties were all running with the country as the electoral unit. It was horrible, and you didn't know who you were running. It was a closed list system. You didn't even know who you were voting for. You were just voting for a list, and then the list officials would decide who actually populated the list afterwards. So it produced many problems. And then they went to a province constituency. So the provinces vote for the lists, and then they're more and more open lists. But it's just, in my view, it's some artsy-fartsy European idea, which is just wrong. It's not the right way to run politics, and it's very unsuited to Iraq. Yeah, in the back.
Thank you, Professor Cole. I was wondering if you could comment on U.S.-Egyptian relationships and where you see that going. Last week in an interview, President Obama said he wouldn't necessarily call Egypt an ally, but then Morsi is expected to visit the United States next week. So I was wondering if you could comment, tell us if that's kind of just a warning from President Obama, or maybe where it's kind of leading something more.
Yeah, thank you. Well, when the Salafis attacked the U.S. Embassy on the anniversary of September 11th, the police didn't intervene very quickly. In fact, it was a good 2 days before they started pushing the Salafis away from the embassy. And that was, let us say, annoying to Washington. And remember, they had a government in the person of Hosni Mubarak who would apparently just do whatever they asked him to. Hosni, we want you to wrestle a crocodile today. He'd go down to Upper Egypt and find one and wrestle it. So to have a government there that we couldn't trust to guard our embassy is pretty annoying, and it's a big change in the status quo in the Middle East. We went from having, I think, not so much an ally, but a puppet. The United States went from having a puppet to having a relatively independent figure in the presidency, and this is very unwelcome to them. And then more especially if he's going to drag his feet about things like security for US officials. Not only did the police not intervene very effectively or soon, which you presumably would be the president that ordered them to intervene, but then the president did not denounce the attacks on the US embassy. Not that day or the next day, or it was like 3 days later, after Obama said he's not an ally, that he came out in Brussels and deplored the attacks. It wasn't a strong statement then either. I think internally, what's going on is that you can never do badly in American elections if you support mom and apple pie. And it's the same in Egypt, that standing up for the Prophet Muhammad will never be a bad move as a politician. So these Salafis who attacked the U.S. Embassy were saying they're defending the honor of the Prophet because this film was made in America. Turns out to have been made by Egyptians. Shouldn't they protest themselves? But in any case, it was rumored that it was made in America, and America was supporting it, although we never heard of it. But for Morsi, the problem is if he cracks down hard on the Salafis who are defending the honor of the Prophet Muhammad against the imperialist American infidels, then he looks like he's joined with the imperialist American infidels against the Prophet Muhammad. And as a leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, you would never ever want to be in that position. So, and then they could slam him for that because his party has to run for parliamentary elections later this year. So I think inside Egyptian politics, Morsi was just in an impossible situation. He dealt with it by not saying much. That wasn't then acceptable to the Americans. So I think that's why Obama slammed him by saying he's not an ally. And I don't know, really, whether Obama knew that Egypt has been designated a major non-NATO ally or didn't know that. I mean, the Republican interpretation is Obama is a naif and doesn't know about foreign affairs to the extent that he was unaware of the status of Egypt. But the response that Obama's office gave is in any case correct, which is that although Egypt was designated as a major non-NATO ally, that terminology doesn't mean what you might think it means. It means that we would be willing to sell Egypt sophisticated weaponry. That's all it means. Maybe we do some military operations with them sometimes. They give us overflight rights. But a real ally in international law is one that you have a mutual defense pact with. So like with NATO, or even Turkey is an ally in the sense that if Russia attacked Turkey, we would actually be obligated by treaty to intervene on Turkey's behalf. We're all nervous that Syria might attack Turkey. The Turks might pull in those chips. So, but those major non-allies, Morocco and Egypt and Kuwait and Bahrain and so forth, they're not mutual defense pacts. So Obama is kind of right that, that Egypt doesn't have that NATO-like status. Personally, I think Obama was a constitutional lawyer and is a very smart man and very knowledgeable, and I suspect he did know that technically Egypt is designated that way, and he was taking it back until Morsi came out and denounced the embassy attacks, and I think it worked because the next day Morsi did take them back. So I think that the two are in for a little bit of a rocky relationship, and that's to be expected when you go from having a puppet to having a relatively independent fundamentalist leader of Egypt. He's just not going to do what the Americans want him to do. They didn't want him to go to Tehran to the non-aligned movement meeting. He went. So he's going to be doing a lot of things they don't like. On the other hand, American relations with Egypt were never about friendship. We're adults. We bribed Egypt to make nice with the Israelis, and we bribed Egypt to make sure that nothing happens to the Suez Canal, through which like 15% of world trade goes. And there are all kinds of realpolitik. We bribed them because we didn't want them going to the Soviet Union in the old days. So people say, well, maybe we'll cut them off if they're not cooperative. Yeah, and you cut them off, and then what leverage would you have exactly over the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt? So my guess is the relationship will be a little bit more rocky, but it will continue with roughly the same contours.
I have a question about, I've heard that Iranian input into the Syrian situation is increasing. They're sending arms, and of course Saudi Arabia is sending arms to the resistance. But the question I have two questions. First of all, I saw an interview with the King of Jordan a few weeks ago on TV, and he was saying, I realize the Iranians are Shia and the Alawites are Shia. He was saying that this sort of Shia, sectarian Islamic conflict is not really what's the most basic aspect of the situation, that this is a Western superimposition on these, that's incredibly inaccurate. But the first part of my question is exactly, if you could clarify exactly what Iran's stake is in the Syrian situation and why they're so eager to uphold the Bashar Assad regime, and then address this business about the sectarian.
Well, Iran's relationship to Syria has nothing to do with religion or ideology. It's purely realpolitik. It's very self-interested. Iran doesn't have any friends. It's very isolated. It can't depend on virtually any of its neighbors to support it. Syria needed a patron after the fall of the Soviet Union. Syria is a relatively poor country. It only pumped about 400,000 barrels a day in petroleum. It's not that much. And it's a country of 22 million. So, and for military and other purposes, it needs a foreign patron because it's up against Israel, which is a good 10 times more powerful than it is. Once the Soviet Union fell and wasn't supporting Syria as much, the Syrians made this alliance with the Iranians. And it is true that the upper echelons of the Ba'ath Party are dominated by the Alawite sect, which is technically, would be considered Shiite. But they're like the folk Shiites. They have a lot of pagan and Christian ideas, and they don't have mosques, and they're not what you would, an Orthodox Shiite Muslim in Qom would call like a Muslim. So the idea that the Alawites are being supported by these Ayatollahs for religious purposes is just, it's like imagining the Roman Catholic hierarchy is really, really gung-ho about Wicca paganism, just because they're both religions. No, it's realpolitik. But the Iranians have several interests in Syria. One now is that since they've got Maliki on their side, there's a kind of Damascus, Baghdad, Tehran, Beirut axis, and it all works together geopolitically. So Syria, without Syria, you can't get Lebanon, right, in the axis. Syria is a land bridge to the Shiites of Lebanon. And one of the ways that Iran has tried to make itself popular in the Muslim world is to be this big rejectionist champion of the Palestinians and to take on Israel. And they do that through the Hezbollah militia, supplying them with arms, missiles, and so forth. Well, the Israelis can take out the Beirut airport at will, and they can control the Mediterranean. So the only way you can get rockets to Hezbollah is through Syria. So if the Iranians lose Syria, they probably lose Lebanon. And then they lose their entire relevancy to the Middle East. And I think they're very afraid of that development. Should we take one more? I know I've probably tired you out. Yeah.
I have a question about Israel and Egypt, and is this Arab Spring, does it kind of mark the end of the Camp David, Jimmy Carter kind of strained relationship between those two to get peaceful? Do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu is very scared, or what do you think his relationship with Egypt will be?
Yeah, so the question is the impact of the Arab Spring on the Arab-Israeli thing. So far I can't see that it has a big impact. The right-wing Israeli take is that the Arabs are all divided and weak and preoccupied, and therefore we can write them off as a security concern. I was in Israel about a year ago, and I met with a former general who had been advisor to the government, and I asked him the same question, aren't you afraid? And he said, no, we have good security cooperation with our neighbors like Jordan, and we expect it to continue. I thought it was an awfully laid back attitude for an Israeli general, but I mean that seems to be their attitude, that they interpret the Arab Spring as the fall of powerful regimes in favor of weak, divided ones, and therefore good in some ways for Israel. And so their emphasis is all on Iran, and I think a way of taking pressure off themselves to do anything serious about the peace process in the West Bank. And of course, they've put more and more settlements over the past 2 years into the West Bank and kind of blown off the Obama administration's attempt to rein them in. So can't see that there's much impact on all that. Now, clearly, if he gets any real power in Egypt, and he still has to tango with the military and so forth, Mohamed Morsi won't be as reliable in helping keep the Palestinians down as Mubarak and Omar Suleiman was. I mean, I think there's evidence in WikiLeaks that Omar Suleiman, Mubarak's delegate to the Palestinians, actually connived at dividing them and keeping them from having a united stance. So Morsi's not going to do that. He's going to be much more in favor of the Palestinians, although he's likely in favor of Hamas rather than the PLO, which is a problem. And Ismail Haniyeh seems to be coming to Cairo next week, about which there's controversy. So over time, Morsi's position on the Palestinians might have an impact, but Turkey switched around from being a strong Israel ally to being critical of Israel, at least on the Gaza issues. And they had that flotilla and so forth, but nothing much has changed, even though Turkey is a big, powerful country. The Israelis basically blew them off. Now, it's not clear that the Egyptians could or would do anything either. And as for Camp David, I think that is set in stone by now. I don't think anybody's going to challenge the Camp David Accords, including the Muslim Brotherhood. Nobody in Egypt that I talk to wants any kind of conflict with Israel. The United States has given them so many sophisticated weapons, and they have such high technological capabilities, they would make mincemeat of any Egyptian force that took them on. And everybody in Egypt knows this. And the older people remember when they didn't have meat 3 times a week because they had to feed the army, and the Israeli wars were eating up the country's foreign exchange and so forth. And nobody wants to go back to that, so including the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think there will be more diplomatic tiffs, and there will be a tenser relationship, but the general architecture of the Camp David Accords seems to be likely to survive these changes. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.